All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today, we're taking a crack at how large language models, or LLMs for those in the know, really think. And you've got some pretty fascinating research to help us go way beyond just scratching the surface here.
That's right. Yeah, we're not just going to rattle off a list of what LLMs can do. We're going to actually map out how those concepts actually evolve inside the models. It's kind of like tracing the whole life cycle of an idea, like watching it travel through all those different layers of the model.
So we're talking about that linear representation hypothesis, right? That idea that LLMs actually encode meaning like along specific directions within their massive thought space.
Exactly. And to really map this out, we're using some cutting edge research. It's on something called sparse autoencoders, or SAEs, if you want to sound cool. You can almost think of them like a special kind of decoder ring. Like, we feed text into the LLM, and these SAEs, they help us see which specific features or concepts are lighting up in the model, like as it's chewing on that text.
Okay, so that's our decoder ring. And the research we're diving into today uses a tool called Gemmascope to analyze a particular LLM, right? Gemma 22B. This isn't some little toy model we're talking about, is it?
Definitely not a toy, no. Gemma 22B, it's got 2 billion parameters. It's a lot, for sure, but it's still manageable for this kind of deep analysis. And what's really cool is that the research goes way beyond just looking at one single layer of this model. It's tracking how features evolve across all the layers, so we're getting a truly multidimensional view.
Okay, so instead of like a snapshot, we're getting a full-on movie of this LLM's thought process. We're going to see how an idea, broken down into all those features, flows through all the layers. Where does it start? How does it combine with other ideas?
And then how do all those combinations ultimately lead to the LLM's output, what it actually says or does? The researchers actually created, they've got visual representations of this. They call them flow graphs. And they use something called cosine similarity to track which features are actually connected across the layers. It's basically a measure of how closely aligned two concepts are in that huge thought space we were talking about.
Okay, so try to picture this. Like, imagine a giant network of colored threads. Each thread, that's a different feature. And cosine similarity that helps us see which threads are all bundled up together, meaning they're related ideas.
Perfect, exactly. And as we move through the layers of the LLM, we can literally follow those threads, see where they start, see how they merge with other threads, and where they end up.
It's like watching an idea literally take shape, like thread by thread. I'm already getting a much deeper appreciation for how these things organize information. But before we get totally lost in the threads, can you zoom out for a second? Talk about the structure of each layer?
Yeah, good point. Each layer has 3 main computational points. We've got the attention output, the MLP output, and then there's something called the residual stream.
Residual stream, that rings a bell. Isn't that the one that acts like a highway?
You got it. It's like the main pathway carrying information between all the layers of the model. And those attention and MLP modules, think of them as processors along that highway. They're refining and transforming all that information as it moves through.
So like a highway packed with data, and these processors are like toll booths or rest stops along the way, modifying the data. Okay, that clicks. So what did the researchers learn about this highway of thought from those flow graphs? What were some of the big takeaways?
One of the most surprising things they found was that most brand new features, they actually pop up in the middle layers of the LLM. And then the later layers, they mostly just refine and spread those features that are already there.
So it's like the middle layers, that's the brainstorming session. That's where all the new ideas get sparked and they start combining. And then the later layers, it's more like the editing and publishing process, right? Polishing the ideas, getting them ready for the final output.
You're spot on. It's a fantastic way to think about it. The researchers actually saw a very distinct 3-part structure to the way those features are distributed across all the layers. Like, it really suggests that there are different phases of information processing going on inside. The early layers, so like 0 to 5 and Gemma 22B, they've got high entropy, means lots of uncertainty, new ideas bubbling up all over.
Yeah, it's like that initial brainstorming phase, right? Throw everything at the wall, see what sticks. But then things start to take shape.
Exactly. So the middle layers, those are 6 to 15, and there you see much more stable dynamics. Those feature formations are getting clearer. It's like those initial ideas are starting to solidify and making connections. Then we hit the later layers, 16 to 25, and now the focus really shifts to refining and spreading those features that are already established.
So less about generating brand new insights, more about polishing and packaging the ones that have already emerged. Interesting how this whole 3-part structure kind of mirrors a creative process out here in the real world.
For sure. And while this pattern was generally pretty consistent across all the different types of text they tested, there were some interesting variations in those later layers. Like, for example, when they fed the model Python code, they saw fewer new features popping up in those later layers compared to when they used natural language datasets.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the difference between writing a novel and writing code. With code, you're not really coming up with totally new programming concepts in those final stages, right? You're mostly refining and debugging what you've already got.
You got it. The model seems to adapt its whole approach depending on the type of information it's processing. And, this research, it also challenges a pretty common assumption, this idea that features in LLMs are always monosemantic, meaning they only represent one specific meaning. The way these features evolve across the layers, it suggests they can actually hold on to multiple related concepts.
Ah, so they're more like bundles of meaning than just single words in a dictionary. Their interpretation gets way more nuanced and complex the deeper we go.
That's exactly right. But we're not just sitting back passively watching this whole flow of features. One of the most exciting parts of this research is that it actually allows for a level of control over the LLM's output, like a level we haven't really seen before.
Wait, hold on. We're not just mapping the LLM's thoughts, we're starting to influence them. Now, this is where things get really interesting.
You said it. The flow graphs, they actually help the researchers pinpoint specific points in the whole processing where they could actually step in and directly influence what the LLM generates. They're calling these points linear feature circuits.
Linear feature circuits. Okay, break that down for me. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, you can think of them like specialized subnetworks within the larger program of the LLM. Each circuit is responsible for a specific task, like recognizing patterns or making associations or even generating specific kinds of output.
So they're like little mini programs within the bigger program of the LLM. Each one has its own job. And by understanding these circuits, we can start to control how the whole LLM processes information.
Exactly right. The researchers used those flow graphs to actually zero in on the circuits where features were being combined in this mostly linear way. It's kind of like tracing a signal through an electrical circuit. You see where the inputs come in, how they're transformed, what outputs come out the other end.
Okay, I'm following so far. So they've identified these circuits, but how do they actually test them? How do you test a circuit that's basically part of the model's thought process?
They came up with a pretty clever experiment where they selectively removed or suppressed certain features within a given circuit, and then they just watched to see how those changes rippled through the model, ultimately impacting what got activated downstream.
So they're like snipping a wire in the circuit and seeing if the lights go out.
That's a great way to put it. Basically, they're creating controlled disruptions to see how it messes with the flow of information. And what they found, it's pretty fascinating. They discovered that deactivating a single feature in a circuit, it actually had a much smaller impact on those downstream features than if they deactivated a feature that wasn't part of a combined group.
So it's like the circuits, they're more resilient to change. If one part gets messed with, the other parts can kind of pick up the slack and keep things running.
Exactly. That seems to suggest that these circuits are more than just linear chains of connections. They're these complex, interwoven networks that can adapt and adjust to changes in input.
So each circuit is like a mini brain within the larger brain of the LLM. It's making them sound incredibly sophisticated.
That's a really great insight. It really reinforces this idea that the residual stream, that's the main highway of information in the LLM. These circuits are like specialized processing units stationed all along that highway, and each one, it's contributing to the model's overall thought process.
This is giving me a so new level of respect for just how complex these things really are. It's not just individual features or layers, it's about how they all work together in this insanely intricate network of connections and circuits.
That's it, and understanding this, that's what lets us move beyond just observing these LLMs. Now we can actually start to control how they process information and what they produce, and that's where things get really exciting.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. Give me the details. How did they actually manage to control the LLM using this knowledge of the circuits and feature flow?
Essentially, what they were able to do was selectively activate or deactivate features across multiple layers. It let them precisely steer the LLM's output towards or away from specific topics.
Hold on, so they're not just tweaking individual features here, they're like orchestrating a whole symphony of changes across the entire model just to hit a very specific outcome.
Exactly, and they were able to get some pretty amazing results. For example, they deactivated features related to scientific concepts and entities, and that actually prevented the LLM from generating any text on those topics at all.
So no more random physics lectures from our AI assistant.
Precisely. They could also bias the output towards a certain topic. By activating features related to religion and God, they were able to make the LLM generate text with this very distinctly biblical tone.
That's pretty mind-blowing. It's like we're suddenly able to whisper directly into the ear of these LLMs and nudge their thinking in specific directions. But before we get carried away with the whole controlling AI thing, what does this actually mean for the future of LLMs? Big picture. What are the implications?
Well, for one thing, it lays the groundwork for building more transparent and interpretable LLMs. If we can understand how all these features flow and interact within those circuits, then we can get a much better understand of how these models arrive at their outputs. And that's super critical for building trust in AI, especially as it gets more deeply woven into our lives.
That's a really crucial point. We can't just treat these LLMs like magical black boxes. If we're going to entrust them with important tasks, we've got to understand the logic behind what they're doing.
For sure. And secondly, as we've seen here, this research points toward a much more precise, much more controllable way of shaping LLM outputs. So instead of making one huge disruptive change to the model, we can make these really subtle adjustments at multiple points. And that should lead to much more predictable and reliable results.
And that's huge when we're talking about things like mitigating bias in these models, right? And making sure that these incredibly powerful AI systems are really aligned with human values and what we intend for them to do.
Precisely. By understanding and controlling how these models process information, we've got a much better chance of steering them away from potentially harmful or unintended outcomes.
I gotta say, this is all incredibly exciting. It seems like people right on the verge of not just understanding how these LLMs think, but actually being able to shape their minds in a very deliberate way. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've only scratched the surface of this research so far.
Right. There's still a lot to unpack, especially when it comes to those linear feature circuits, how they were identified, and all the different ways they were tested. We've got a lot more to uncover.
And lucky for us, we've got plenty of time to explore all those details. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to take a closer look at those deactivation experiments. We'll break down all the different methods the researchers use to really test those circuits and figure out how they truly tick. So stay tuned. All right, so we're back and ready to dig even deeper into those linear feature circuits inside LLMs. Remember, those are like the specialized subnetworks we talked about, each one tackling a specific job within the whole model.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating way to think about how these LLMs process information, almost like a whole network of mini brains all working together.
Right, and last time we were talking about how researchers use this technique called deactivation to test those circuits, like they were selectively cutting wires to see how it messed with the information flow. But they didn't just stop there, right? They actually took it a step further and compared different methods of deactivation to see which one was best at revealing those cause and effect relationships between features.
Exactly. It wasn't just about flipping a switch. It was about choosing the right switch to flip to get the most useful insights.
Okay, so what were these different methods? What kind of things did they try?
Well, they tested out 4 main approaches. Each one had a different strategy for choosing which features to deactivate within the circuit. The first one they tried was based on something called permutation. It basically involves rearranging the order of features within the circuit.
So like shuffling the deck and see how it changes the game.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's the second approach called top one. Here, they deactivated the single most similar predecessor feature based on that cosine similarity we talked about.
So targeting that one feature that's most closely aligned with the one they're interested in, kind of like finding the closest relative in a family tree.
Another great analogy. Then they moved on to top, where they deactivated the top 5 most similar predecessor features.
Ah, so instead of just going after one feature, they're casting a wider net now, seeing how deactivating a whole group of related features impacts the circuit.
Exactly. And finally, they tried a random approach, where they just randomly picked one of the top 5 most similar features to deactivate. This acted as a kind of control group to see if it really mattered which features they were messing with.
Okay, so 4 different approaches for poking and prodding those circuits. What did they find? Did any of these methods really stand out as being more effective than the others?
Well, interestingly enough, the random approach was actually the least effective.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? If you're just randomly snipping wires, you're not likely to have a very predictable impact on the circuit.
Exactly. That really suggests there's a meaningful structure to these circuits, and just randomly disrupting them doesn't really tell us much. The top one method, though, where they zeroed in on the most similar predecessor feature, that turned out to be much more insightful.
So like finding that one crucial link in the chain and seeing how the rest of the chain reacts when it's gone.
A perfect way to put it. And what they found was that deactivating that single, most similar feature, it often had a huge impact on the activation of those downstream features. That points towards a really strong cause and effect relationship.
So choosing the right features to deactivate, that's key to figuring out how these circuits actually work. It's not just about turning things on and off. It's about understanding those relationships between the features inside.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just whether a feature gets deactivated, but also how much it's messed with. The researchers played around with different levels of rescaling for those features.
Right, rescaling. That's like adjusting the volume knob on a specific feature, right? Either amplifying it or suppressing it to see how it impacts things.
Exactly. And what they discovered was that different groups of features, like those circuits we've been talking about, they reacted differently to different levels of rescaling. Some circuits were way more sensitive to changes than others.
So some circuits are like finely tuned instruments, while others are more like a tank that can handle more of a beating.
That's a great way to think about it. For example, circuits that involved features from both the residual stream and the MLP module, those were really sensitive to positive rescaling.
So boosting those features, that really kicked them into overdrive. Kind of like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. It really shows how important those MLP modules are in shaping the flow of information. They're like amplifiers in the circuit, pushing that signal forward.
Makes sense. But then on the other hand, you had those features that mainly came from the residual stream. Those were most affected by negative rescaling.
Right, meaning that suppressing those features, that had the biggest impact on what the circuit produced.
So toning down the residual stream features, it was like putting the brakes on the whole system.
Precisely. Again, this backs up the idea that the residual stream is that main information highway carrying most of the signal throughout the entire model.
Okay, so messing with those residual stream features, that's like controlling the flow of traffic on the highway, while tweaking those MLP features, that's more like fine-tuning the engine of a car. You're making adjustments at different levels of the whole system.
Another great analogy. And all of this, all these insights from those deactivation experiments, it led to something pretty remarkable. The ability to actually steer the LLM's output in a very precise way.
This is what I've been waiting for. Tell me, how did they actually manage to control what the LLM was generating?
They took what they learned about feature flow and those circuits, and they used it to selectively activate or deactivate features across multiple layers of the model.
So they're not just manipulating individual features now, they're like conducting a whole orchestra of changes across the entire model, all to get a specific outcome.
Exactly. And they got some incredible results. Like by deactivating features related to scientific concepts and entities, they were able to stop the LLM from generating any text on those topics.
So no more surprise physics lectures from our AI buddy.
You got it. But they could also nudge the LLM towards specific topics too. By activating features related to religion and God, they could steer the whole model toward generating text with a really strong biblical flavor.
Wow, that's really something. It shows just how much potential there is to fine-tune these models, to really shape what they produce in a very deliberate way.
It's a powerful demonstration of how understanding the inner workings of these models, that understanding can translate into real-world control over how they behave.
But, this isn't just about making an LLM say what we want it to say. This research, it has some much broader implications for the whole future of AI, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This research is opening up a whole new world of possibilities for creating LLMs that are more transparent, more interpretable. And that's going to be crucial as these models become more powerful and more integrated into our lives.
Right, if we're going to trust these models with important stuff, we have to be able to understand how they work. We have to make sure they're aligned with our values and what we want them to do.
Couldn't have said it better myself, and this research is a huge step toward doing just that.
This is all so fascinating, but I got to be honest, it's a little daunting too. The more we learn about these LLMs, the more complex they seem to get. It makes you wonder if we'll ever truly grasp the full extent of what they're capable of.
It's a valid concern for sure, but I think we can look at this complexity as both a challenge and an opportunity. The more we learn, the more questions we uncover, and that's what drives scientific progress.
You're right, and this research really shows the incredible strides we're making in understanding these powerful tools. But, we've only just scratched the surface of this paper. Remember those deactivation experiments we were talking about? The researchers didn't just test those circuits with one method. They actually compared multiple approaches to see which one worked best at uncovering those cause and effect relationships between features.
And those comparisons, they actually revealed some pretty surprising stuff about how information moves through those circuits. They also tested how different levels of feature manipulation, that rescaling we talked about, how that impacted the LLM's output.
Sounds like we've got a lot more ground to cover, so for everyone listening who's as eager as we are to keep learning, hang tight. Because in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to really get into the weeds with those different methods they used to test those linear feature circuits. And we'll explore how the researchers were actually able to control the LLM's output using all this knowledge. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back for the grand finale of our journey into the minds of large language models. We've been through a lot together, mapping those flows of ideas, finding those fascinating linear feature circuits that act like little brains inside the big one.
And we've seen how researchers can actually tweak those circuits to control what the LLM spits out. It's a pretty big leap forward, I'd say, in understanding how these complex systems actually work.
For sure. In the last part, we were diving into those deactivation experiments, remember? Where researchers kind of silenced certain features in a circuit just to see what happened to the information flow. They tested 4 ways of picking which features to deactivate. We had permutation, top 1, top k, and then that random approach.
Yeah, and what we learned was that just randomly messing with the circuit didn't really do much. There's definitely a structure to these things. Picking specific features, ones that were similar, that was the key to figuring out how they work.
Exactly. But they didn't stop there. They went a step further and played around with how much they were manipulating each feature. They called it rescaling.
Right, think of it like adjusting the volume knob on a specific feature. Crank it up or turn it down just to see what it does to the circuit's output.
And what they found was different circuits reacted differently to those tweaks. Some were way more sensitive than others. Like those circuits with features from both the residual stream and the MLP module, they were really sensitive when you boosted the signal, that positive rescaling.
Yeah, that really highlights how important those MLP models are. They're like the amplifiers of the circuit, really pushing the information through.
Okay, so like the residual stream, that's the main highway. And the MLP modules, those are the engines.
I like that, a good analogy. But remember those features that mostly hung out in the residual stream? Those were the ones most affected by negative rescaling when you turn the volume down.
So that's like hitting the brakes on the whole system. Okay, so messing with the highway features, that's traffic control. Tweaking the engine features, that's fine-tuning.
You got it. And all of this, all the stuff they learned from these experiments, it led them to something pretty amazing. They were able to actually steer the LLM's output, precisely control it.
We touched on this before, but I want to dig in. How did they do that? How did they control what the LLM was making?
Well, they took everything they knew about feature flow and those circuits and used it to activate or deactivate specific features. But they were doing this across multiple layers of the model, not just one.
Okay, so not just messing with one feature, they're conducting a whole symphony here, changing things across the entire model just to get a specific result. That's wild.
It is, and the results were pretty impressive. Like, remember those features related to scientific concepts and entities? When they deactivated those, the LLM just stopped generating any text on those topics, period.
No more surprise physics lectures from the AI.
Exactly. But they could also push the LLM in certain directions, too. Like, by activating the features related to religion and God, the output started sounding a lot more biblical.
That is really something. It shows you how much potential we have to fine-tune these things, really shape what they produce in a deliberate way. This is about way more than just making an LLM say what we want, though, right? It has bigger
It's
implications.
huge implications, yeah. This kind of control, it opens up some exciting possibilities for tackling some of the ethical issues around LLMs.
Right, like bias. We've talked about that before. This research suggests we might be able to actually tackle bias in these models head-on by messing with the circuits responsible for those problematic outputs.
Exactly. And this deeper understanding, it also helps us make models that are more transparent, easier to understand. If we can follow the flow of information, see how those linear feature circuits work, then we can start to get a handle on how the LLM is making its decisions.
And that is essential if we're going to be able to trust these increasingly powerful AIs to do important things for us. We can't treat them like black boxes anymore. We need to know why they're doing what they're doing.
Couldn't agree more. This research is a big step towards being able to trust AI.
It's been a wild ride. We started with decoding single features, then mapped their flow through the layers, found those awesome circuits, and now we're seeing how we can actually control what an LLM produces.
Shows you how crazy complex these models are, but also how far we've come in understanding and maybe even shaping how they think.
This research, it definitely leaves me with more questions than answers, but that's kind of the exciting part, right? It's all about pushing the boundaries of what we know, uncovering the next mystery.
Absolutely. Who knows what we'll find as we keep exploring these powerful tools?
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed exploring this with us.
Keep those brains working, folks. Keep asking questions. Never stop learning.
And until next time, stay curious.